Hey, good morning. It's March 24th, 2022 at approximately 9 a.m. my time. And in this ongoing saga to try to connect with many people, maybe millions of people, maybe tens of millions of people, I am just trying to connect with you on a one-on-one basis and also the millions of us who need to come together because every moment of every day something is revealed that creates this sort of intersection between my work, our work, something that's taken me years and years and years to put together in the grand scheme of things that really is the central tumor of everything that we're in the midst of as this country continues to get in more and more turmoil and more people could potentially find themselves in more and more desperate situations. And I'm desperately trying to reach all of you, especially those of you who have character, who actually give a living shit about the United States of America as a country of liberty and justice for all, as a country that has the dignity of the integrity of law, where no man is above the law, and that means most particularly no corporation is above the law. We live in a fictional time, a fictional economy, a fictional scenario which has created an absolute confluence of toxicity that's created the American nightmare, and I want to resurrect the American dream. So here are a few things that are at the top of my mind this morning. So yesterday, it was revealed that the New York Times found out that two prosecutors in the District Attorney's Office of Manhattan by the name of Pomerantz and Dune had resigned because they were pretty much infuriated with the newly elected District Attorney of Manhattan, a guy by the name of Alvin Bragg, who is an African American who wasn't moving forward or fast enough on the criminal prosecution of Donald Trump. Now, I know there's a lot of Trump supporters out there who think that Trump was the answer to the corruption that led to Trump. He's not. Here's the scenario as it relates to ultimately what Mr. Bragg, who's probably, I would imagine, a very well-placed African American in a system that probably plays ball with the elites of that incredible elitist city that operates behind the facade of this corruption that I'm trying to inform you of, as well as the corruption, of course, that constitutes Donald Trump's business practices. So it's a no-brainer. So for example, I was watching, I don't know, maybe a half dozen news reports from mainstream media this morning of reporters that were trying to, present what was kind of going on and what the centerpiece of the story was. And it was absolutely clear to me that these reporters couldn't figure out financial fraud if their life depended on it. They know about as much as final financial fraud is, some of these beautiful women that we see all over the place that, snapshot their money makers. They have no idea what it is that I'm trying to tell you. So what is Donald Trump guilty of on the base level? Well, first of all, his entire enterprise was a fraud shop for decades. Okay, and there's a criteria, a methodology, which we call control fraud. Now, control frauds were run by CEOs of all the financial institutions, and this is how they do it. Have you ever asked yourself how banks make money? Well, banks make money by providing mostly loans, okay? Now, they obviously take our deposits, they can leverage those deposits, and through the proper underwriting standards, they're supposed to be able to make a whole, panoply of loans, whether it's for business, whether it's for cars, whether it's for this, for that. And then there's specialty lenders that deal primarily in real estate and massive loans, jumbo loans, those sorts of things. And those people that deal in those loans, that put it together, that are supposed to do all the due diligence of underwriting, they make massive fees when you make big loans or a high volume of loans. So the CEOs of Wall Street, for example, used control fraud to do what the four elements of control fraud. What they are is you've got to grow like crazy, making a huge volume of loans, using absolutely little leverage, or I should say, the leverage in terms of equity, the equity to debt ratio, based on no buffer, okay? So you don't have the money to make the fractional reserve loans, and you're banking on more loans coming in. And so what happened in the lead up to the great financial crisis is there was a saying in the industry, a rolling loan knows loss. And the only way that happens is if you increase the appraisal value of the assets that you're lending against. So if you're taking into context tens of millions of loans all over the United States, and you've got all of these different banks, the only way they could grow was to make more and more loans because there was a huge global appetite to invest in mortgage-backed securities, presumably because the safety and soundness of the system, which used underwriting standards and backstop to make sure that what the banks were selling, which were called, these securities, that they met with the reps and warranties that were in the prospectus that investors, particularly involving retirees, were investing in, because you want to maintain the collateral, the flow of the collateral, the asset value of the collateral. So it's almost a sure thing. But it's smoke and mirrors if you get rid of A, your underwriting standards, and B, your the appraisal value. If you can get the appraisers to constantly increase the value, then you can loan against that. So that's what's going to lead to what we call three sure things. A, you're going to have massive amounts of growth, and B, you're going to have huge compensation to the board and the CEO, and three, you're going to have catastrophic consequences. This is how we build bubbles. How does this relate to Donald Trump? Donald Trump has been involved with control fraud his entire existence. It was revealed just 2 months ago that he had a Midtown Manhattan apartment that was 10,000 square feet, that he amplified to 30,000 square feet, that was worth approximately $50 million, that he amplified to $250 million in this documentation fabrication. Why? To get more and more loans against that asset. That's just one example of everything that he did, because he and then of course, Donald Trump has had a long history in these developments that he doesn't pay, the people that, worked on his projects, across the board. And then ultimately he's getting pocketed the whole time, and he doesn't even own the collateral because it's his name that he licenses out. So the whole thing's a fraud recipe. And then throughout the whole time period, he was able to work with Deutsche Bank, which was the only company that ever gave him loans, that he ultimately sued for being a victim of predatory loans. And the reason why this is really ironic is it relates to Alvin Bragg. He's an African-American prosecutor as the DA, and ultimately Trump was in something they're not even looking at, but he was found guilty of predation in Trump University. And I would not be surprised, even though Trump got late to the game with Trump mortgages, that if you realize that there was all sorts of documentation fabrication happening that could get minorities into loans very quickly, to where they used all sorts of deceptive acts and practices to make loans. Why would Trump do that? Well, because that's what the entire industry was doing, and you can make fees like crazy, and it doesn't matter if you blow up. How many times have you guys heard that Trump is all about bankruptcy and all about working with other people's money? That's his whole business model. So at the very basics of this, Alvin Bragg, an African-American prosecutor or DA in the prosecutor of the DA's office of Manhattan, isn't moving forward. But why? So if we want to have a standard, for example, I pay attention to Rob Reiner, who's this actor who your younger generation is probably not going to recognize the name, but there was this terrific television show series in the 70s called All in the Family. He played a guy by the name of Meathead. He was everybody in the United States knew who Meathead was. Anyway, Rob Reiner on Twitter every single day is going absolutely bonkers that the Attorney General's office of the United States isn't going all over Trump because of a whole potpourri of reasons, whether it was the insurrection and all of the other fraud that he's engaged in. And obviously that's going to bleed over into what the district attorney's doing in Manhattan. That's supposed to coincide with what another African-American who is the AG of New York has been investigating on a civil fraud violations to the Trump organization, which also includes tax evasion and all sorts of different documentation fabrication that was rolled out 3 years ago, quite frankly, when they were looking into impeaching Trump to begin with. But it goes way, way, way back. I mean, I've seen stuff from Alex Gibney on Dirty Money that goes back to his casinos. I mean, this guy's been doing this kind of stuff for decades. And that's why I want to remind all of the Trump supporters out there that he's been burying the white working class and everybody who you guys are his entire career. Why would you want to champion a guy who's actually been your enemy the whole time? Just because he's white? I don't get it, but whatever. That's what's going on. But here's the other irony. If we want to get absolutely pissed off about Alvin Bragg, an African-American DA, prosecutor who's not investigating Trump, well, we got to hold the same standard, do we not, to Eric Holder and Barack Obama, who let institutions that were significantly larger than Trump's operation. We're talking about Chase, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, onward, through the system and the panoply of everybody. And by the way, in the financial system, it wasn't everybody, playing this game. It was just the big guys, the independent banks around the country, and oh God, I can think of a whole potpourri of lending institutions that weren't involved with this, that did the proper underwriting, that did what we expect, based on what are safe and sound rules, because a lot of the times those institutions were on the hook, in local communities or geographical regions in a way that maybe the big national banks weren't. Because, in the big national banks, when they're looking at, all of the trades and everything else that boost their bottom line, all the people are just numbers on a spreadsheet. So they don't connect all the devastation that takes place on Main Street with what's on their books, because all they're looking at is numbers. So that makes you expendable. You're expendable in a grand scheme that enables this to happen. But you got to ask yourself, well, okay, A, how do banks make money, which I laid out, and then B, where do they get the money to be able to do that? Well, they can get money free from the Federal Reserve. That's the whole point. Like every other business, you have to buy raw materials to be able to do your business. Whether you're a developer, whether you're in some sort of retail, whether you're in agriculture, it doesn't matter. Everybody's got to invest in whatever is going to be able to ultimately make that product and get it to market, but not the banks. They get free money. They get free money that go through asset managers that go into this black box casino that can be hyper manipulated through fraudulent means. All of these are crimes, okay? They're literally felony crimes that would lead you and I, if we did this, into jail for years. But when you're a CEO and you're dealing with trillions of dollars, hey, no problem, no harm, no foul. Why? Because A, they get the free money from the system to to inflate all the loans and all of the other different sorts of games that these monsters create at your expense. And then ultimately, what do? They buy the freaking politicians. We've legalized corruption, and so they own Congress. Congress is the only entity that actually could stop them if there was a critical mass to put people into positions of power that were actually armed with the truth. Because I can tell you, watching all of these different journalists out there, I don't even call them journalists, they're just talking heads, hired somebody out of college who might look pretty, who has no idea how any of this freaking stuff works. And ultimately, they're telling us stuff that just doesn't even add up to, like, the ABCs of this, let alone the full composite of it. So you have just what we call fake media. And Donald Trump knows that, which leads to what these two prosecutors in Manhattan decided to, quit in protest, because the law is not the law. Kudos to them. Looking at all of these different variables that I have access to, it doesn't seem like it would take much to convict Trump. But there's not a political will, because Donald Trump's got like 65 million of you or 75 million of you that voted for him in the last election. And what are you voting for? For him to drain the swamp? He didn't drain the swamp. He put all the guys that are responsible for this madness at the apex of the system. And I'm pretty sure that Donald Trump was able to get away with, several $100 million through the CARES Act. That's a whole nother apparatus that nobody's ever talked about. We're in a shit show, a shitstorm of corruption. And I'm going to lay it out to you two other elements that I think you should consider, because I get these questions sometimes. It's like, okay, this was yesterday's news, the stuff that you're talking about on the con, and, how does it affect me? How stupid do you have to be? It's not yesterday's news. That's what I'm telling you. It's now. It's the intersection of everything that happens. And also, if it doesn't concern you, you Mr. Red, White, and Blue, who waves your flag at patriotism, stands up to salute during an NFL football game, and you judge other people who are actually kneeling, because they're disgraced by these lies in all forms. But the bottom line is, our troops that were in Afghanistan for 20 years. I just watched this documentary last night, and I was aware of this. But many of these troops, they used to say the only reason they're there is to look out for their brother in the field, because they knew that nobody back home actually gave a shit about why they were there in Afghanistan to begin with. And ultimately, all of that came from 9/11. We never went after Saudi Arabia, who was deeply, deeply mired in all of the elements that led to 9/11. But we go into Afghanistan, which was at a point made a lot of sense, didn't make sense 20 years later because of corruption. So I saw these guys walking around, minefields. They could only go every 3 feet, for fear of blowing up an IED. And, could you imagine the stress of just thinking that you could be just demolished at any moment? And they had to contend with this with absolutely no strategy, but the only thing that was undergirding it all was corruption to pay off warlords that were involved with all sorts of sex trafficking and drug trafficking. And then ultimately, who does it benefit? It benefits the military-industrial complex that's providing all of these munitions, but not for a strategy to win, a strategy to keep it going. So their stocks could, continue to go up so that the middlemen who aren't in the field could actually get paid shit tons of money, while maybe your cousin or your brother or whomever got blown to bits in frickin' Afghanistan trying to fight, an entity that created 9/11, which was the right fight, but then it got convoluted and all this other stuff. And at the apex of that, so for example, and I'll finish with this thought for this morning. So, as I'm absorbing all of this stuff as it relates to Donald Trump and Alvin Bragg and maybe the non-prosecutions and these 2 prosecutors that are, resigning in protest and that sort of thing, and what it means based on everything I just said, I turn the page, literally on my computer as I'm absorbing all of the headlines from this morning. And one of the headlines is from none other than Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock. And he says that the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Putin's war in Ukraine, has ended globalization as we know it. Okay, this is in a letter to his shareholders. And so BlackRock is the largest asset manager in the world, operating north of $10 trillion in assets. This guy, as I've said in previous videos, ultimately found himself in the wonderful position of being the administrator of the Fed emergency stimulus programs that had to clean up the world after the 2008 great financial crisis, where we gave trillions of dollars to the criminals that blew it up all in the first place. And to remind you, Larry Fink and BlackRock and Blackstone and Schwartzman were deeply involved with mortgage-backed securities the whole time. And that blew up the world based on illegal deceptive acts and practices and a whole insane amount of civil rights felonies across the board that nobody ever prosecuted, because I'm trying to get to the point that you can't be just disgusted with this guy Alvin Bragg and Trump if you're not disgusted with Eric Holder and Barack Obama for not actually doing what the government's supposed to do in situations like this, which is hold the criminals accountable. No, they just freaking worked out this shell game where they gave them trillions of dollars. They did a press release of getting billions of dollars in fines, and nobody goes to jail. And by the way, the fines weren't paid by the banks or out of the pockets of the guys who created the problem that blew up the world. No, it came from shareholders. But I guess the shareholders in the end are okay as long as the share price goes up. It's insane. But going back to Larry Fink ultimately says globalism is over as we know it. And he's going to create, and BlackRock is right now in the midst of creating economic war against Russia. Well, how do you think Larry Fink is able to create economic war against Russia? Well, because he's at the apex of the Federal Reserve policy that can do all of these things behind the scenes, what was the financial system, SWIFT, that could basically choke all of the arteries that the oligarchs and all the rich guys have been extracting money from. It's all corruption. Okay, it's all corruption. And so Larry Fink is acting like he's doing us all a favor, and now I might be on the same page of derailing Putin, but guess what? Larry Fink and the financial system destroyed the American dream. Okay? They got rid of upward mobility, they got rid of the integrity of law, and the judiciary ultimately went hat in hand to, this financial corruption to bury the most innocent people that I saw on display yesterday in Miami, for example. Get a load of this in context to all the glory of patriotism and the rest. So I'm close to a defense attorney who was once a prosecutor who was defending this African-American woman who was a 37-year-old veteran of, being a public school teacher, and her husband was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, and they were both African-American, so it's kind of like the American dream and all these things that we're going the right way for people who contributed to society in all the right ways. But she's having her house stolen right now. She's never been behind on her mortgage payments. She's never been behind on her taxes. And yet I just witnessed the judge do a two-step that's basically allowing Bank of America foreclosure mills and lying attorneys to steal her property predicated on documentation fabrication, which again, from the bottom, goes to the top. That's what Trump does. Documentation fabrication to get loans and launder money and do a control fraud and all these other things that Alvin Bragg, an African American, isn't going to prosecute. Why? I don't know. Ask Eric Holder and Barack Obama the same thing. I get maybe he's trying to get $140 million at the end of this, like Barack Obama did. Could that be a possibility? Look, I know all this stuff sounds hyperbolic and it sounds insane because it is. Onwards and upwards.